Last time I spoke about the development of Jewish law from the oral tradition until the Code of Jewish Law, what's called the Shulchan Aruch. So I'm going to take a pause with that for a moment and talk about Hanukkah. And then after the break, I'll continue with we left off there. So in here, let's see if I can find it. I think I have here. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Some sources on Hanukkah. Not here. A bit further. No, also not. Here it is. How do I do this? Okay, so let's start in general about Hanukkah. Um, the holidays in the Jewish holidays, the ones that are mentioned in the Bible, are first of all what we call the three pilgrim holidays: Passover, Pesach, Shavuot, Jewish Pentecost, and Sukkot, Jewish Tabernacles. So these are called the pilgrim holidays. They start with Passover because the Jewish year starts with Passover as far as the months are concerned. The first month is Nisan, and the Torah actually says in Exodus chapter 12, it refers to Nisan as Chodesh HaAviv, which means the month of the spring. And Passover after always has to be in the spring. We left Egypt in the spring, and that's the way it has to be every year. And maybe I'll talk, but not today, about how the lunar year keeps up with the solar year in Judaism. You know that well, the Western world uses the solar year. Um, the Muslim world uses the lunar year, and Judaism uses a lunar calendar which is integrated with the solar calendar. So, based on a system that Passover will always be in the spring. Because if you only have a lunar calendar, you will be back 11 days every year because there's 11-day discrepancy between the solar calendar and the lunar calendar. Just to explain, if there are 365 and a quarter days in a solar year, the lunar year are 12 months of 29 and a half days, which is the time it takes the moon to go around the earth. If you calculate how much that is, it's easy to figure out 30, 29, 30, 29, six times. You'll realize six times of each, you'll have 354 days. So 354 days is 11 days away from 365. So the Jewish lunar calendar is integrated. There is a leap month 7 times in every 19-year cycle, and every now and then there's a month which is longer, 30 days and 29. And based on this, the calendar is integrated and it comes out the same over a longer period of time. The Talmud refers, by the way, to the Jewish calendar as the secret of the calendar, because the mathematical calculation of the calendar was considered very innovative in that time. They called it the secret of the calendar and the leap years, Sod Ha'ibur in Hebrew, is the way the Talmud refers to it. So we have Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and then, of course, in the month of Tishrei, we have Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, which is on the 10th of the month, Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement. And then, of course, what I mentioned before, which was the Sukkot holiday. But you have the pilgrim holidays, you have the holidays which have to do with, let's say, taking stock and thinking about um, trying to penitence, let's say, at the beginning of the year. And these are basically the holidays from the five books of Moses. But we have two holidays which are rabbinic. First of all, they're rabbinic because they're not mentioned in the five books of Moses. The first one being Purim. Now, Purim is mentioned in the Jewish Bible because there is the scroll of Esther, which tells the Purim story. And in the last chapter of the scroll of Esther, it actually says that the Jews took upon themselves as a holiday this this occasion. I'll show it to you. Maybe we can look it up right now. If I can find it quickly, I'll show it to you. Hold on. I have to move it like this. Okay. Let's see. Esther chapter 10. Moment. Oh, it's not chapter 10, it's chapter 8 then. Oh, it's chapter 9. Okay, let me show it to you. Hold on. Find you again. Okay. Okay, this is the scroll of Esther, chapter 9. After they tell this story of after the Purim story is told, it says, um, therefore the Jewish villagers who lived in the open towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar, which is the day that Purim is kept today, a feast and a festive day, and sending portions one to another, portions of food. And Mordechai described these things and sent letters to all the Jews in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both far and near, to make this day the 14th day of Adar and the 15th in walled cities every year, being a holiday, just like the way the Jews rested from their enemies, the month that was reversed from grief to joy, from mourning to festivity. Should make days of feasting and joy and send portions of food one to another and give gifts to the poor. The Jews took upon themselves what they had commenced to do, etc., etc. So basically, in the story here, it says that Purim was made into a holiday during that time under the Persian Empire. But how do you make a holiday? Because you have rabbinic holidays and only two rabbinic holidays. So why did these two rabbinic holidays become holidays? And can you add a holiday in addition to them? That's the question. Now, let me just answer that question before I continue. And the question is to understand that we have to really understand what it means to have a rabbinic holiday in the first place. As I said, the Purim story is mentioned in the Bible. It is in the scroll of Esther. Hanukkah is not. Hanukkah happens well after the canonization of the Hebrew Bible. It takes place from 167 before the Common Era until 164 before the Common Era, at the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era. That's at least 100 years after the Hebrew Bible was already sealed and canonized. So how does Hanukkah become a holiday? And basically the question is, how does Purim become a holiday? Not only that, we have 4 fast days, which are mentioned in the book of Zechariah, but not in the 5 books of Moses. How do they become fast days? What is the authorization for that? But we know they did, because in the book of Zechariah, he talks about these 4 days, which are days of fasting. He mentions them because he says they will eventually become days of joy when the temple is rebuilt in the book of Zechariah. So I can even show that to you in Zechariah. I'll give you the exact, I think it was chapter 9. One moment. No, here. One moment. Okay, one moment. It's Zechariah 8:19. Zechariah 8, verse 19. Where are you? One moment, I can't find you anymore. If I do that, I sort of I lose you. I don't know where I am. Here. Zechariah, what did I say? 8:19. So the people turn to him and they say, um, when the temple is going to be built, what do we do about the fast days? And his answer is the fast day of the fourth month, which is the 17th day of Tammuz, and the fast day of the fifth month, which in Hebrew we call the ninth of Av, Tisha B'Av, and the fast day of the seventh month, which is the fast day of Gedalia, right after Rosh Hashanah, and the fast day of the 10th month, which is called the 10th of Tevet. All these dates are mentioned in the Bible, but not as fast days, meaning the five books of Moses. Excuse me, in the book of Kings. But Zechariah says these days will become days of joy and jubilation for the Jewish people once the temple is rebuilt. So they'll be gone. After the temple was destroyed a second time, they became fast days again. And to this day, these 4 fast days over Jerusalem are still kept as a Jewish post, as a Jewish fast day. Each one about the temple. As I said, the 10th of Tevet is when the Babylonians and later on the Romans made a siege around Jerusalem. The 4th month, which is Shivas Arba Tammuz, is when they broke the walls of Jerusalem, specifically that one in the second temple. The 9th of Av is when both temples were destroyed. And the 7th and the fast of the 7th month, Gedalia, is when Gedalia, the head of the Jewish community, after the destruction of the first temple, was assassinated by a fellow by the name of Yishmael ben Netanya. And then the Jews went down to Egypt. So these 4 fast days were reinstated after the second temple was destroyed. So we do have such a thing for fast days. But fast days, I can understand if the community takes upon itself, okay, they took upon itself and that's it. But how do you instate holidays? The way this is done is, you see, in Judaism, to instate a holiday, a real holiday from, let's say, from the Pentateuch, is a day where you don't work. The rabbis don't have the power to do that. But what they do have the power is to instate a day when it's supposed to be a happy day. And also you can say what's called the Hallel prayer. The Hallel prayer is a prayer of praise to God, of thanksgiving. It's based on the Psalms, and there's a blessing before and after. And we say this we recite it on every biblical holiday, including Hanukkah, by the way, every day of Hanukkah. And the only reason the Talmud says we don't recite on Purim is that Purim took place outside of Israel, and we were still in exile under the king Achashverosh of the Persian Empire. But in general, the Talmud claims that it can be done on a rabbinic holiday as well. So the rabbinic holidays actually have very little, aside from as I said before, this prayer called the Hallel, the prayer of thanksgiving, which we do say in the morning prayers. And aside from mentioning Hanukkah in our silent prayers, what's called the Amidah, we light the candles in the evening, and that's it. There's not a lot of things that we necessarily do on Hanukkah. Same thing on Purim. Well, Purim is one day instead of 8, of course. But on Purim, there's a few things that we do. We read the Scroll of Esther. We give portions of food one to another. We give money to the poor. And we drink a little bit also at a special meal for Purim, preferably wine. And that's it. That's what we do. So it's not exactly like holidays from the Torah where there are a lot of specifics that have to be done. So it's more holidays of Thanksgiving. And both these cases of Hanukkah and Purim were cases where the Jewish community was on the verge of destruction. In Purim, because Haman wanted the king to allow him to destroy the Jewish nation. And even Hanukkah, once the Maccabees decided that they were going to create a revolt against the Seleucid Empire, they were taking a very big risk. The Seleucids could have come in and wiped them out. That didn't happen in the end, so the story had a happy ending. I'm just saying it could have theoretically happened. So the Talmud also sees that as something which was justified. And of course, the sovereignty came back to Judea, Jewish sovereignty. And that was the Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted from 164 all the way till about, I'd say till the time of Herod, about 40 years before the Common Era. Even before that, it felt, because the Romans under Pompey conquered Jerusalem about 68 before the Common Era. So let's say till 68. Before the Common Era, you had a Hasmonean Empire, which is, that's not bad. That's over 100 years of an empire. So that's one thing I want to say about Hanukkah. Another thing is, about Purim, we know very little about the story of Purim, except for what it says in the Bible. And what it says in the Bible, if we talk about it one time, there's a lot of questions about the story of Purim, about the narrative. But about Hanukkah, where we don't have a scroll in the Bible, we have at least 4 very important sources which tell us about Hanukkah, and some of them are very exact. So we really know everything about the battle, everything about the revolt, what were the reasons, what led up to it, what happened after it. The most important source, of course, is the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees 1, especially chapter 4, but all of the book of Maccabees 1 tells the whole story. What happened before with the Seleucid government. It actually starts with the story of Alexander of Macedonia taking over this area of the world in 332 before the Common Era. And when Alexander dies, he has 4 generals who divide up his empire. 2 of them take pieces of land in this area. In the area of Syria was Seleucid, Seleucus, and in the south, where the area of Egypt was Ptolemy, or in Hebrew, Talmai. So the Hanukkah story takes place under the Seleucid Empire, under a king who was called Antiochus IV, and was also referred to as Antiochus Epiphanes or Epiphanes. Now, the unusual thing about the Hanukkah story is that we know that Epiphanes made all these decrees against Jewish observance in Judea. Why do I say that's unusual? Because normally both the Persians and the Greeks in these areas, as did the Babylonians, had no interest in getting involved in the religious and cultural life of the people that they controlled. Since they had empires, and their empires were multicultural, with many minorities, they didn't want to stir the boat. They didn't want to stir the pot. So all the minorities were able to do whatever they wanted as long as they realized who the king was and paid their taxes and followed the laws. That was it. That's the way these empires worked. The Babylonians, the Persians were the same way. And when the Greeks conquered the Persians, they acted the same way. Just to give an example, the story of Cleopatra, who was eventually overthrown and committed suicide. Cleopatra was, of course, a Ptolemaic queen in Egypt. So that's a Hellenistic Ptolemaic queen. But she was so involved in the culture of Egypt that she adopted certain traits of the culture. And we know that when she saw that she had lost the war, she requested a bowl of fruit. And in the bowl of fruit was a cobra serpent, a cobra snake. And the cobra snake bit her and killed her. Why did she want that? Because according to Egyptian belief, if you are killed by a cobra, you have eternal life. And that's Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic queen. So the point is that these Hellenistic kings and queens were very close to the cultures that they were ruling and normally didn't have a problem with it. That's why Antiochus IV, in that sense, is an anomaly. According to what we know, he makes these decrees against the Jews that they shouldn't keep the laws of circumcision, and they shouldn't keep the Sabbath, and Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and a few things which are mentioned, which are mentioned both by the Book of Maccabees and by Josephus Flavius, and also by a later book that we have, not a book, but a later scroll, which is called the Scroll of Antiochus, but that's much later. But the point is, we know really a lot of Hanukkah. We know exactly when it happened, and the book of Maccabees 1 is so detailed that it's clear that whoever wrote the book, some anonymous Jew, either took part in the revolt or had lots of friends who took part in the revolt, because the details are really clear. We really know everything about the revolt from that book. Maccabees 2, which is not in the Christian Bible, I think only Maccabees 1 is in the Christian Bible. So Maccabees 2 continues with talking about the festival of Hanukkah. In it, there is a letter where Judah writes to his brethren in Egypt and requests that they also keep the festival of Hanukkah on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev. And I guess they agree to that. And that's where it starts, and then it continues the story. But Maccabees 2 already is continuing the story, what happened after the events of the Hanukkah story. And as you know, not everything was rosy under the Hasmonean governments. They took losses and defeats, just like they also had moments of glory. It was they also had internal conflicts, but they did last for over 100 years. Maccabees 3 and 4, which is part of the Apocrypha, seems to be taken from the writings of a Jewish historian called Jason of Kiren. And so it's a bit of a slightly later date than Maccabees 1. So Maccabees 1 is probably 2nd century before the Common Era, but Jason of Kiren is at least 100 years later. I can look him up. Okay, so let's read a little bit from Maccabees 1. It says about the Hanukkah story. I'm only taking it the last part where it gets to the actual story of how they come into Jerusalem and take over Jerusalem and the temple, because that really is the focus of the Hanukkah story. So that would place us here. Maccabees 1, chapter 4, from verse 36 until verse 48. You see it? I don't have it in Romanian, but if you might be able to find it in Romanian, actually. I assume you could. Let's see if I have it in Romanian. I don't think I do. I have it in English, and we'll look at it here. Okay, so then Judas, meaning Judah, and his brothers. Remember, the Maccabees were 5 brothers. There was Judah, who was the oldest. Their father was Matityahu. I don't know how they say that actually in Greek. In Hebrew, say Matityahu. It's actually very similar to Matthew, but usually Matthew is Mati, but Matityahu would be pronounced probably differently. Then there was Jonathan and Jonathan and Yochanan and Elazar and Shimon. Those are the 5 Maccabean brothers. So Judah and his brethren said, "Behold, our enemies are discomfited," meaning we're winning. "Let's go up and clean and dedicate the sanctuary," meaning the temple. Upon this, all the hosts assembled together, meaning they all came together and went up to Mount Zion. Today, for those who know, Mount Zion is just outside the walls of the old city, but it wasn't at this time. And Mount Zion is, if you're looking at Jerusalem from the south, it's actually the first thing you're going to see on the left of the city, Mount Zion. When they saw that the temple was desolate, the altar where their offerings were brought was profaned, the gates were burned, and the shrubs growing in the courts as in the forest, or in one of the mountains, and the priests' chambers were pulled down. So they tore their garments, they tore their clothes, and they made great lamentation, and they put ashes. I don't know, you say ashes in Romanian, something which is burnt, ashes on their heads.
Cenușă.
Okay, thank you. And then they fell down to the ground upon their faces, and they blew the trumpets, and then they cried to heaven. And then Judah appointed certain men to fight against those who were in the fortress, because next to the temple, the Greeks had built a fortress to watch over the temple, that the Jews not go in without their permission. So they went to fight against the fortress until they cleaned the sanctuary. They took priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, meaning the Torah. And they cleansed the sanctuary and took out all the pagan worship. And all the defiled stones they took out. As they consulted what to do with the altar, which was profaned, they weren't sure. They thought it best to pull it down. So, because the non-Jews had defiled it with their paganism. So they pulled it down, laid the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place, that one day when a prophet shows up, the prophet will say what to do. Problem was, on the one hand, it was a holy altar. On the other hand, it was used by the Greeks for idolatry, so they weren't sure whether to destroy it or not, so they just put it away somewhere. Then they took the whole stones according to the law, because according to the Bible, you're not supposed to cut the stones of the temple with something made out of metal. So they would take whole stones and use them to build the temple. And they built a new altar, which was similar to the previous one. And they redid the sanctuary and all the vessels that were in the temple. And they hallowed the courts. They sanctified the courts. And they made new vessels. And they brought in the candelabra, the menorah, and the altar of the burnt offerings of the incense, and the show table. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlesticks they lit. They might light them in the temple. They put the loaves of bread on the showbread table. They spread out the veils that were between the parts of the table, and finished all the works. And on the 25th day, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is called Kislev, the 148th year of the Seleucid government, he rose up in the morning, brought sacrifices according to the law on the new altar, and at the same time, the same day, the heathens profaned it, they dedicated it with song, harps, with cymbals. Then all the people fell on their faces, which means they bowed down, worshipped and praised the God of heaven, who had given them good success. They kept the dedication of the altar for 8 days and brought offerings with gladness and sacrifices. And they decked all the forefront of the temple with crowns of gold and with shields. They renewed the gates and the chambers, and there was gladness among the people. And Judah and his brothers and the whole congregation of Israel ordained that the day of the dedication of the altar, the 25th day of Kislev, to be kept in every year for a span of 8 days from the 25th day of Kislev, with myrrh and with gladness. So we actually see in the book of Maccabees, they're talking about the Hanukkah festival, 8 days. The reason given in the book of Maccabees for the 8 days is because it took them 8 days to dedicate the new altar, to rebuild it the way it was supposed to be, to find the right stones. They weren't allowed to cut the stones, so they had to fit in place. And so this took them 8 days. That's the story. And the dedication of the temple, I assume, also took 8 days. Not just the altar. Even though it is called Chanukata Mizbeach, the dedication of the altar. But possibly the whole dedication of the temple took 8 days too. So this is according to the book of Maccabees. So the book of Maccabees says in this 148th year of the Seleucid government, on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, the Jews dedicated the temple, and of course it also mentions how they overcame their enemies, and they had already liberated Jerusalem at this point. Now, I want to read you the same story and how it's told in Josephus' Antiquities. As you know, Josephus Flavius is a first century Jewish historian, but he is employed by the Romans. His story was in the Jewish war against Rome, which happened with ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. Josephus was a captain of one of the battalions, and I guess he realized the war was not going well, and they were going to lose. So he went to the Romans and just switched sides. Now the question is, there's a discussion: is he a traitor? Is he not a traitor? I'm not even going to go into that question. He does get. He considers himself a very proud Jew, but he's also a Kohen, according to what we know. But he gets a job by the Romans to be an official historian, and he is asked to write the story of the battle, of the Jewish battle against Rome in the year 70, which he does. And that's his book, The Wars of the Jews. And then he writes another book called Antiquities, which is the history of the Jewish people from the beginning of the Bible until his day. So he has a lot of very interesting stuff. He has a third book called Contra Appionum, where he is opposing an Egyptian fellow whose name is Appion, who is very anti-Jewish, and he tries to explain what the Jewish religion is, etc. Contra Appionum. So I want to read to you from the Antiquities the way Josephus talks about the Hanukkah holiday. This is Antiquities, chapter 12, paragraphs 6 and 7. When the generals of Antiochus's armies had been beaten, Judah assembled the people together, and he told them that after many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem and purify the temple and offer the appointed sacrifices. But as soon as he and the whole multitude came to Jerusalem, they found the temple was deserted. Its gates were burnt down. Plants were growing in the temple on their own accord because of the desertion. He and those who were there began to lament and to cry, and were quite confounded at the sight of the temple in such bad shape. Then he chose some of his soldiers and gave them the order to fight against the guards who were in the citadel, until he should have purified the temple. By the way, so far, it's exactly like the book of Maccabees. When therefore he had carefully purged the temple purged the citadel, and then he brought in new vessels into the temple and the candelabra, the candlesticks, the bread table, the incense altar that was made of gold. He hung up new veils in the gates, the partitions, and added doors. He took down the altar of burnt offerings and built a new one of stones that he had gathered, stones that were not hewn with iron, because according to the law, you're not allowed to. And then on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, the Macedonians, called Apollians, they lit the lamps and the candlesticks on the candelabra, the menorah, and offered incense on the altar, put the loaves of bread on the showbread table, and burnt offerings upon the new altar. So it fell out that these things were done on the very same day in which their divine worship had fallen off and was reduced to a profane and common use after 3 years' time. So it was that the temple was desolate by Antiochus for 3 full years. Until now, Josephus is not really saying much more than we just saw in the book of Maccabees. This, by the way, the last point is a very interesting point. I've only seen the book of Maccabees and Josephus. Maccabees claims that the 25th day of Kislev on the Hebrew calendar was the exact day 3 years before that Antiochus had taken over the Jewish temple and made it a pagan temple. So when they were taking over the temple the 25th day of Kislev, that was on purpose. They wanted to make a point. He profaned it on this day. We are going to purify it and rededicate it on this day. So both Josephus and the book of Maccabees makes this point. I have not seen other people write about it. I don't know why. I guess if they mention it, it's probably true. So, this desolation happened to the temple in the 140th and 5th year, on the 25th day of the month of Apuleians in the calendar, and the 153rd Olympiad. It was dedicated anew on the same day, the 25th of the month of Apuleians, which we call Kislev, and the 148th and 154th Olympiad. 148th is the Seleucid government, 154th is according to the Roman Olympiads. And this desolation, or no, excuse me, the Greek Olympiads. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 408 years before, for he declared that the Macedonians dissolve worship of the Jews. This is something which the book of Maccabees does not mention, and seems to be an interesting innovation of Josephus. He claims that Daniel, the book of Daniel, has a prophecy telling exactly when the Macedonians would dissolve the worship of the Jews 408 years later. Okay, I'm not sure where he takes this from, but it's definitely not in the book of Maccabees, what he just said. I'm going to continue. So Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and he omitted no sort of pleasure. They feasted on rich and splendid sacrifices and honored God. By the way, to feast on a sacrifice, because in Judaism, most sacrifices, part goes on the altar and part are eaten by the priests. And even certain sacrifices are also eaten by the people bringing them. Depends which one. And he honored God and delighted by hymns and psalms. They were very glad at the revival of their customs. After a very long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained their freedom of their worship. Unexpectedly. And they made it a law for posterity that they should be able to keep their festivals on account of the restoration of their temple for 8 days. From that time on, we celebrate this festival and call it Festival Lights. Another thing he says, which is not written anywhere else, it's called the Festival of Lights. This is actually very important because from the book of Maccabees, it doesn't say anywhere that there is a custom for Jews to light Hanukkah candles. In the book of Maccabees, this is not mentioned. When Josephus is writing in the 1st century, the Jews call it the Festival of Lights, you can already assume they're lighting candles. Or else why would it be the Festival of Lights? Nobody had electricity. So obviously this was, they were already lighting candles by the 1st century. The Talmud is talking about this, of course, in the 3rd century. But by the 1st century, it's quite obvious the Jews were already lighting candles. So when exactly it happens, it's hard to know. I'm going to assume it probably already happened under the Hasmonean dynasty at some point. This idea of lighting candles to remind us of the candles that were lit on the candelabra and the menorah in the temple. But another thing, there's a very fine point here that you have to notice when you're reading Josephus Flavius. Remember, Flavius is writing for the Romans, so the Romans are going to edit the book. And it's very hard for Flavius to talk about the story of Hanukkah. He's writing in the 1st century. Hanukkah happened approximately 250 years before him, maybe a little bit more. But Hanukkah was a revolt against an empire where the Jews revolted against the Seleucid Empire, which was successful. How do you talk about something like that under the Roman Empire? They may get the wrong idea. The Romans might think that you're trying to encourage the Jews to revolt. So obviously he can't say that. Not only he can't say that, but I have to say he's not the only one who realized this problem. We have a book, which I mentioned, called the Mishnah. It is the first corpus written down of the oral Torah, of the oral tradition. There is one holiday which is missing from the Mishnah. Can you guess? Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Mishnah. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, who's living in the 2nd century under Roman occupation, is afraid to talk about Hanukkah, which was a successful revolt against an occupying empire. The Mishnah only mentions Hanukkah en passant when it's talking about certain times of year, but not even as a holiday. Nothing. Only in Babylonia, in the time of the Gemara, which I said is the expansion of the Mishnah, the discussion of the Mishnah, that part of the Talmud, there you have discussions on Hanukkah. But under the Romans, they were afraid. Under the Babylonians, it was okay. So that's basically what happened. So Josephus is also very nervous about this. How do I present Hanukkah? Now let's read it again. You'll see that he's presenting Hanukkah, not that the Jews won the battle against their enemies and brought back their sovereignty to Jerusalem. No, it's a battle to return their religious rights. Watch, let's read it again. You'll see. Again, Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple. That's what it is. It's the festival to restore the sacrifices. Honored God. They were very glad at the revival of their religion, of their customs. You see? It's not about Jewish sovereignty. It's not about taking over the temple and winning the enemy. It's the revival of their customs. They unexpectedly regained freedom of worship. See what's happening? Now, it's obvious why he's doing that. But he has to explain to the Romans, no, this is a festival of the freedom of worship. Okay, there were Seleucids, whatever, something happened there, whatever happened. But it's the festival of freedom of worship. So the Romans can say, okay, freedom of worship, we agree with that. That's not a problem. But it's just interesting how he bypasses the things that are said in the book of Maccabees because he's nervous about the editor. And from this time on, we celebrate this festival, call it the Festival of Lights. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us. This liberty, keeping our religion. That's why they call it, the name was given to the festival. Judah also rebuilt the walls around the city, just reconstruction, and reared towers of great heights against incursions of enemies. Don't say anything about the power that's in charge of them. He set up guards. He also fortified the Bethsura that might serve as a citadel against any distresses coming from our enemies. He doesn't say who the enemies might be. So he's very careful about that. And obviously it worked because it's in the book, or else it would have been taken out. So he was careful about that. Okay, so that's our second source of the Hanukkah story. Source number one, Book of Maccabees, 2nd century before the Common Era, quite early. Second source, Josephus Flavius, 1st century of the Common Era, after the destruction of the temple. Also a relatively early source, about 250 years after it happened. And then, let's see what else I brought here. Okay, this is very interesting. This is a prayer that we say in the prayer book on the festival of Hanukkah 3 times a day in our prayers, and also when we have a meal and say the grace after meals. It's a prayer that the Talmud says that we're supposed to add to our prayer books on Hanukkah. It was already added to the prayer book during the time of the Geonim in Babylonia, which means we found it already by the 8th century, but it predates that. And it talks about the miracles that happen, one for Purim and one for Hanukkah. I'll read you the one for Hanukkah. And as I said, this I'm assuming that this is actually a first century document. It goes back that early. Um, I would say it was probably written during the time of the temple. I'll give a couple of reasons why I think so. Um, it's a quite early document. El Hanisim, which means concerning the miracles, for the miracles. For the miracles, this is part of we add this to the prayer service in what's called the silent meditation, the silent Amidah, the Shmon Esrei, which we say 3 times a day in the Jewish practice. For the miracles and for the redemption, for the mighty acts, for the salvation and for the wars that you have done for our forefathers in those days, in this season, at this time. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan, high priest, Hasmonean and his sons, the wicked Greek king, Seleucids were Hellenists, rose up against your nation Israel, make them forget your Torah, and remove from them the laws of your will. You in your great mercy stood up for them in their time of distress. You fought their fight. You judged their judgment. You turned over the strong, meaning the Seleucid soldiers, in the hands of the weak, definitely weak in numbers, Hasmoneans. And the impure, because they were pagans, in the hands of the pure. And the wicked in the hands of the righteous. And the sinners in the hands of those involved in your Torah. And for you, God, you made a great and holy name in your world. And for your nation, Israel, you did a great salvation, redemption this day. After this happened, your children came to the Holy of Holies of the house. It's actually not the Holy of Holies. This is a mistake. Devir is what's called middle part. It's called the oracle, the middle part. The 3 parts of the temple, the outer part, which is called the Azara, where the animal sacrifices were brought, the middle part, which is called the oracle, or Devir in Hebrew, or Heichal, which is where you had the menorah, the candelabra, the showbread table, and the incense altar. And then the inner part, the Holy of Holies, you had the tablets of the law. And they cleaned this abode and sanctified the sanctuary, meaning the middle part, lit the candles in the courtyard of your sanctuary, and established these 8 days of Hanukkah with thanks and praise to your great name. So really, this prayer is very similar to what it says in the book of Maccabees. Very, very similar. And I'm assuming it was actually based on the book of Maccabees. I'm going to even, I would not be surprised if it was as early as the Hasmonean government introduced. I would not be surprised. And one thing which is not mentioned in this prayer is that Jews light candles on Hanukkah, which I said at some point was introduced, some point at the end of the Second Temple period. So that's another reason why it's very possible that this is a very early prayer introduced into the Hanukkah story. Now, let me look at, okay, I'm missing one more, but I will find it for you. It's not here, I'll find it for you. There's one more source I want to read with you. I don't have it here. So let's look for it. It's what the Talmud says about Hanukkah. Hold on. Not sure I didn't include it. Let me put it in. Here it is. But let's see if I can find it quickly. One moment. It's somewhere in here. Here it is. Find it harder to find in the English than in the Aramaic. Here it is. Okay, let me open it up. I lost everybody else, but here. This is the Talmud on Shabbat. I told you the Mishnah doesn't mention Hanukkah. Talmud mentions Hanukkah apropos lighting Shabbat candles. In the second chapter of the tractate of Shabbat, it discusses lighting candles on Shabbat. And Talmud says, wait a sec, there are other candles, the candles of Hanukkah. So, and that's where the Talmud discusses Hanukkah, meaning the Gemara. Moment. Yes. So, if you can see it here, let me take this away. Shabbat 21b. The Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah? First is discussing the laws of Hanukkah, and then all of a sudden it comes up, what is Hanukkah? So this is, by the way, this is interpretation. This is the text, the bold print, and the interpretation is the light print. So he says, and why are the lights kindled on Hanukkah? Gemara answers. Sages said in Megillat Ta'anit, this is correct. This is a quote from the scroll of Ta'anit. The scroll of Ta'anit is a scroll that was put together under the Hasmonean empire rule. It's hard to call them an empire. The Hasmonean rule, because they actually had a very small sovereignty. Their borders were that small. Their northern border was an acre, Akko. Their southern border was in Ashkelon, about half the size of the state of Israel today. It was quite, it was a small, but yeah. So Megillat Ta'anit was days when you're not supposed to fast because these are days of joy. It's the first instance that we find in our history of national holidays, which are not necessarily religious holidays. Meaning, just like you have national holidays, okay, if I take Canada where I was born, so there's Canadian Independence Day, that's a national holiday. In the state of Israel today, you also have Israel Independence Day. You have Jerusalem Day, when Jerusalem was taken over again in 1967 and reunited. You have Yom HaShoah, the day commemorating the Holocaust, the Shoah. You have Soldiers' Memorial Day in Israel. So this happened also under the Hasmonean government. They had national days in addition to the days which they celebrated from the Bible. And in addition to Purim, which they did celebrate, and in addition to Hanukkah, which they eventually started to celebrate. And these days were very often days where they won battles. Like, for instance, there's the day called the Day of Nicanor. It is the 11th day of the month of Adar, which is 3 days before Purim. And the Day of Nicanor is a day of festivity because there was a battle against a Greek general called Nicanor. And when they won the battle, they made it a national holiday. But those national holidays, the only things which were, let's say, the only things that showed them as being different days from a Jewish point of view is that you were not supposed to have a private fast on that day. If a person, for whatever reason, want to have some type of private post for, let's say, for religious reasons of their own penitence. And also, if somebody died, you're not supposed to eulogize them publicly, because it's a day of festivity. So So in the Megillat Ta'anit, it also mentions Purim and Hanukkah, in addition to the other days which are brought. So in Megillat Ta'anit, it describes what Hanukkah is, and that's what the Gemara is quoting here. On the 25th day of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8 days. One may not eulogize. Somebody passed away, you bury them, but the eulogy has to be somewhere else. One may not fast on those days. A person wants to do a private fast. What's the reason? Because when the Greeks, meaning the Seleucids, entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary of the temple. The Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious. They searched and found only one cruse of oil, one little flask of oil, that was placed with the seal of the high priest. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum, being the menorah, for only one day. A miracle happened. They lit it, and the candles lit for 8 days. Next year, the sages instituted and made these holidays the recitation of the prayer of thanksgiving, which we call the Hallel, and other types of thanksgiving of prayer, the Al Anisim we just read before. Okay. So here we have a description of the holiday of Hanukkah, which has certain things which are the same of Book of Maccabees, but certain things which are not. So what's the same? Anybody figure out what's the same? I'll read it again. When the Greeks entered the sanctuary originally 3 years before, they defiled all the oils in the sanctuary. They really defiled the whole temple because it was pagan. The Hasmonean monarchy overcame them, emerged victorious. They searched and found only one flask of oil that still had the seal of the high priest, meaning it was still pure and untouched. And there was enough to light the candles just for one day. The miracle happened. They lit it and it lasted for 8 days. Next year, sages instituted these days and made them a holiday. This is different from this description and the description, the Book of Maccabees, Josephus, and even the prayer Al Anisim. There seems to be a major difference here. Okay, nobody can get it, so I'll have to tell you. Reason all of a sudden, even though in this text it does say that the Hasmoneans had a monarchy and they won their enemies, but they mention it en passant. It's like apropos. Yes, they overcame it's sort of like, and when they overcame their enemies, the Greeks, they went to the temple, purified the temple, and lit the candles. And there was there was a miracle that the candles lit for 8 days and not one, and that's why you have Hanukkah. So basically, according to this description, the whole festival of Hanukkah is because there was a miracle that the oil burned for 8 days. But if that's the main reason for Hanukkah, why doesn't it say that in the Book of Maccabees? Why doesn't Josephus mention it? Why doesn't the prayer that was instituted in our prayer books mention it? What happened? How come everybody forgot about it? Okay? Now, what happens sometimes when historians discuss this, they'll say, okay, well, maybe this was made up in order to give a better interpretation because they don't want to talk about under the Babylonians and under the Romans how they defeated the. I think no, I don't think that's the problem. To make this a little bit more complicated, I'm going to bring you the original text of the scroll of Ta'anit, the scroll of fast days, which was put together. We have a critical edition by a professor from Tel Aviv University. I'll just bring it for one moment. Ah, okay, unfortunately, my library is not organized enough. So I'll just tell you what in this in this book on the scroll of the fast days, which is a scroll from the Hasmonean kingdom. Um, Vered Noam, this professor from Tel Aviv University, says that there are actually three versions of the scroll. There are actually two versions of what she calls the hybrid version, where they took both versions and mixed them together. And that's what we have in our in the manuscript form. So they're basically three versions. Let's call it A, B, and the hybrid. In one of the versions, it tells the story exactly like the book of Maccabees. That they went in, they overthrew the Seleucid government, the Seleucid Greeks, they purified everything, and they lit the candles, exactly like the prayer of Al-Anisim. But it doesn't mention a miracle. In one version, no miracles mentioned. In a second version, they do mention that there was a miracle, but then they say that the reason that Hanukkah is 8 days is because it took 8 days to dedicate the altar, and not because of the miracle. And in the hybrid version, which is the one that the Talmud is quoting, it puts the emphasis on the flask of oil, which burned for 8 days. So the Talmud took one version out of three known versions and used that one, which puts the emphasis on this miracle which happened with the flask of oil, and says that's the reason. So I want to tell you what I think is happening here. In my humble opinion, if there is a version which talks about the miracle of the olive oil burning for 8 days, I'm not going to deny it. You see, very often, I know that from the state of Israel today, there are many, many miracles that happen during wars. People who don't think they're going to come out alive and do come out alive. I mean, I've heard crazy stories just from the war we're in right now. And you hear lots of things. So miracles during wartime are not unusual. And you could have had something and it burned for whatever reason. But even if there was a miracle of the oil flask, anybody who lived at the time of the Maccabees and witnessed this guerrilla warfare of a small group of people led by these Maccabean brothers, bringing the Seleucid Empire to their knees and allowing them to have an autonomous state, was probably in total shock. Now, we know what the political reason was, the historical reason. What happened was, after 3.5 years of war, and it's very hard to fight guerrilla warfare, like we see in Gaza, how long it's taken for the IDF, because they were hiding here and hiding there. The Russians were not able to beat the Afghani rebels because they kept going into their caves. The Russians were able to kill 1 million of them, but they didn't win the war. They lost 80,000 soldiers, killed 1 million Afghans, but weren't able to win the war. So my wait. So let me get back to this. My point is that anybody who lived at that time, they probably heard that there was a miracle of the oil flask, but that didn't impress them. What impressed them was the fact that Judah was able to get back Jewish sovereignty with the green light of the Seleucid Empire. And all of a sudden, they were controlling Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. It was a shock. I'll tell you why it actually happened from what we know. As I said, the Hasmonean revolt was 3.5 years. And the Seleucids, it's not that they couldn't. The question is they didn't want to after a while, because exactly after those, in that 3.5 year period, the Persians attacked the Seleucids. When the Persians attacked the Seleucids, they said, we don't have time to waste on any soldiers with these crazy Judeans. We'll just cut a deal and give them what they want and just continue. And that's exactly what happened. They cut a deal with Judah. They said, you're still under us, but you have an autonomy, and we will respect your autonomy, but we don't have time for this. And that's what happened. But the fact that it happened was a shock. It was a total shock. So when in Ala Nisim, which starts off, and for the miracles, they're referring of the miracle of Judah being victorious over the Seleucid Empire. They don't even understand how it happened. As I said, we discovered historical documents about what exactly happened. But for the people living at that time, it was a total miracle for sure. What's an oil flask in comparison? Nothing. However, the problem is like this. Hanukkah in the Second Temple period was the paradigm of Israel Independence Day, Judea Independence Day. That's what Hanukkah became. 8 days of celebration because they got back their sovereignty in the year 164, and they kept it until the Romans took over with Pompey in 68 before the Common Era. Then the Romans appointed Herod in the year 40 to be in charge of the Jews. You know, somebody who at least is Jewish. His father was a Judean convert to Judaism, but he was Jewish. And he even married Miriam, the last Hasmonean, in order to show that some legitimacy. But the Talmud, or the Gemara, which is being written in Babylonia, this is after the destruction of the Second Temple. There's no Second Temple. Jerusalem is now a pagan city run by the Romans. Jews are allowed to live in the Galilee. That's it. Most of the Jews are now living in Babylonia. The rabbis had a problem. And the problem was, what is the meaning of Hanukkah, which in the Second Temple period was understood as Judea Independence Day in Babylonia? Maybe it's insignificant. Maybe we should just forget about it. So what the rabbis did was they decided, no, we're not going to forget about it. We're going to reinterpret. Until now, people, during temple times, they celebrated it as Israel Independence Day, but it was called Judea Independence Day because that was the name of it. That's the way they understood it. And they were probably right. But now what do you do in Babylonia? What is the meaning for somebody living in Babylonia when we don't have independence in Judea? So the Talmud says, well, there's another story here, and that's the story of the candelabra, which represents Jewish culture and spirit and religion. And that's a very important point living in Babylonia now, to keep the religion, the culture, the beliefs strong, because the winds of change are very easy when you're in another culture, which is a dominant culture. So let's talk about that miracle, that forgotten miracle of the oil flask, which is some there. It's within one of the versions. We're going to make that the most important part. We will not deny what happened, that there was a monarchy of the Hasmoneans that were able to defeat the Seleucid soldiers. We'll mention in one line, but the emphasis will be on the oil flask. And that's the emphasis of the important, to light your candle in that dark, to keep the Jewish religion going. And that's the way Jews understood it from that time until the establishment of the State of Israel. For the whole diaspora, this is the way Jews understood Hanukkah, because that's what it was reinterpreted to mean. But now with the reestablishment of the State of Israel, we can re-understand Hanukkah. It really was a day of Jewish independence in the Second Temple period. And in the State of Israel today, we have Israel Independence Day. It's a different day, that's okay. But I'm saying Hanukkah always had both meanings since that time. It had the meaning of Jewish independence, the importance of sovereignty, the temple, Jerusalem, but it also had the idea of standing up for your beliefs and for your customs and your etc. So it's still, but in Israel today, it means both. Outside of Israel, it meant more one than the other. So it's an interesting example how the Gemara wanted to slightly reinterpret or switch the emphasis from one syllable to another syllable. you might say, in order to make sure that it would be perpetuated by the Jews, who could have easily said, but we don't have independence anymore, and couldn't make that argument anymore after it was reinterpreted. So this is basically what I want to say about Hanukkah. Um, yeah, and so I think the next time we meet is, what is it, 3 weeks? Something like that. Well, whatever it is, I'll find out from Felicia, and, and that will be it. Okay, I'm not sure if the other people are here, but you'll be able to, I will make, I'll stop the recording, and you'll get the link in the WhatsApp group, and that's it. When we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about the Bible commentators, and why all of a sudden there were Bible commentators in the 11th century. Yeah. Okay. Shalom, everybody, and to see you again. That's it.